February 27, 1999. On the set of The Sopranos in Brooklyn, Tony Sirico stepped into a tracksuit, slipped on a few gold chains, adjusted his silver wings hairstyle and became Paulie Walnuts. To millions of viewers, it looked like another actor preparing for another role. But there was one major difference: Tony wasn't pretending. Before HBO cameras ever rolled, he had already lived the life that Paulie represented. He'd been arrested 28 times, survived armed robberies, taken bullets, spent years inside Sing Sing prison, and run with associates connected to the Colombo crime family. Most actors spend months researching gangsters. Tony Sirico spent decades trying to escape being one. That's why Paulie Walnuts never felt like fiction. He wasn't a performance. He was a lifetime of experience brought to the screen. Born in Brooklyn on July 29, 1942, Tony grew up in Bensonhurst, a neighborhood where organized crime wasn't something you watched in movies, it was part of everyday life. Money was scarce, opportunities were limited, and the local wise guys looked like the most successful men on the block. They wore expensive suits, drove flashy cars, and carried an authority that demanded respect. As a young boy, Tony admired them, running small errands and soaking in everything he saw. By his teenage years, school no longer interested him. The streets became his classroom, and the neighborhood social clubs became his education. He learned who held power, how loyalty worked, and why silence mattered. Before long, he was spending more time around criminals than ordinary people, and it wasn't long before he became one himself. His first arrest came in the early 1960s after a robbery, but instead of changing direction, Tony sank even deeper into the criminal world. Throughout the decade, he became associated with crews connected to the Colombo crime family, earning a reputation as someone who wasn't afraid of violence. He specialized in armed robberies, carried illegal weapons, and developed the kind of street reputation that earned both respect and fear. Friends described him as charming one moment and explosive the next. If someone disrespected him, he didn't hesitate to settle the score with his fists or worse. Arrests became a regular part of his life. Weapons charges, assaults, robberies, and extortion investigations followed one after another. Some cases were dismissed, others resulted in jail time, but none of them convinced him to leave the streets. In that world, surviving prison only increased your reputation. Everything changed in December 1971 during a warehouse robbery that ended in a shootout with police. Tony was struck by 2 bullets, one grazing his leg and another lodging dangerously close to his spine. He survived, but instead of freedom, he found himself under arrest while recovering in a hospital bed. Facing serious prison time, he had 2 choices. He could cooperate with authorities and reduce his sentence, or stay loyal to the code he had lived by his entire life. Tony never considered talking. He accepted his punishment and was sent to Sing Sing Correctional Facility, one of New York's toughest maximum security prisons. Life inside was brutal. Violence was constant, fights were common, and solitary confinement became familiar territory. But prison also introduced him to something completely unexpected: acting. A volunteer theatre program gave inmates an opportunity to perform, mostly as a way to pass time. Tony joined with no expectations, yet quickly discovered he possessed a natural presence that couldn't be taught. When he played hardened street characters, he wasn't memorizing behavior, he was simply drawing from his own experiences. Acting coaches noticed his authenticity immediately. Other inmates believed every performance because they already knew the man behind it. For the first time, Tony realized the same personality that had helped him survive on the streets might actually build a legitimate future. When he was released in 1975, instead of returning full-time to organized crime, he decided to chase acting. Breaking into Hollywood wasn't easy, but directors immediately recognized something unique. Tony didn't look like an actor pretending to be a gangster. He looked like someone who had just walked out of a Brooklyn social club. His early roles were small appearances in crime films and independent productions, usually playing mob soldiers or neighborhood tough guys. Movies like Crazy Joe, Fingers, and Defiance slowly built his ersum. During the 1980s, he continued appearing in crime dramas while occasionally slipping back into old habits. Arrests continued, though none resulted in lengthy prison sentences. Eventually, after his 28th arrest, Tony reached a turning point. Nearly 50 years old, he realized his luck wouldn't last forever. If he kept living both lives, one would eventually destroy the other. This time, he committed fully to acting and never looked back. Throughout the 1990s, his face became increasingly familiar in mafia films. He appeared in Goodfellas, Bullets Over Broadway, Gotti, Mickey Blue Eyes, and several other productions. Casting directors loved him because authenticity couldn't be manufactured. He already spoke the language, understood the body language, and carried himself exactly like the men these stories were based on. He never had to study mafia culture because he had spent decades surrounded by it. Still, these were supporting roles. Tony had no idea the opportunity that would define his career was just around the corner. In 1998, HBO began casting a new television series called The Sopranos. Creator David Chase needed someone to play Paulie Gualtieri, better known as Paulie Walnuts, a loyal but unpredictable mob soldier whose personality balanced comedy, paranoia, and genuine menace. The moment Tony read the script, he recognized the character instantly. He had known countless men just like Paulie during his years in Brooklyn, and in many ways he saw pieces of himself staring back from the page. But before accepting the role, Tony made one demand. Paulie could never become a government informant. He could never betray the Mafia code, no matter what direction the story eventually took. Chase agreed, and that single decision shaped one of television's greatest characters. Unlike several other gangsters in the series, Paulie Walnuts would remain loyal until the very end because Tony Sirico refused to portray anything else. The Sopranos premiered in January 1999 and immediately changed television forever. While audiences were captivated by James Gandolfini's Tony Soprano, another character quietly became one of the show's biggest fan favorites. Paulie Walnuts wasn't the smartest gangster or the most powerful, but every scene he appeared in felt completely believable. His sharp gestures, constant concern for respect, obsessive superstitions, flashy tracksuits, gold jewelry, and unmistakable Brooklyn attitude didn't come from acting classes, they came from Tony Sirico's real life. He borrowed habits from men he had known growing up, recreated conversations he had heard in social clubs, and added personality traits that only someone raised inside that world could understand. That's why Paulie never felt exaggerated. He felt authentic. Every glance, every insult, every burst of anger reflected decades of real-life observation. The cast quickly realized they weren't simply working with another actor. Between takes, Tony would tell stories about robberies, prison fights, wise guys he had known, and people who had disappeared because they broke the rules. For younger actors like Michael Imperioli, those stories became an education. Tony described surviving a police shootout, getting arrested from a hospital bed after being shot, and enduring years inside Sing Sing as casually as if he were talking about yesterday's weather. He rarely dramatized his past because to him it wasn't entertainment, it was simply the life he had lived. James Gandolfini and the rest of the cast often said Tony brought a unique sense of realism to every scene. His presence reminded everyone that organized crime wasn't just a movie genre. It was a world filled with violence, fear, loyalty, and consequences, and Tony had experienced every part of it firsthand. That authenticity wasn't lost on the people who understood the Mafia best. According to numerous accounts, real mobsters became devoted fans of The Sopranos, and many of them admired Tony Sirico more than anyone else on the show. They knew he had done prison time. They knew he had lived by the street code long before cameras arrived. Most importantly, they respected the promise he made before accepting the role. Tony had insisted that Paulie Walnuts would never become an informant or betray the Mafia code. For some actors, that might seem like an unusual request, but for Tony, it was personal. Even after leaving organized crime behind, he refused to portray a character who violated the values that had shaped his early life. David Chase honored that request, allowing Paulie to remain loyal from the first episode to the last. That decision didn't just define the character, it reinforced Tony's reputation among the very people whose lives inspired the series. As The Sopranos grew into one of the greatest television dramas ever made, Paulie Walnuts became one of its most recognizable faces. Fans copied his hairstyle, quoted his one-liners, dressed like him for Halloween, and bought merchandise featuring his image. Yet Tony understood something many viewers didn't. The life people found entertaining on television had nearly destroyed him in reality. Behind every joke and every memorable scene were memories of prison cells, violent confrontations, friends who never made it home, and years spent wondering whether the next knock on the door would be the police or someone looking for revenge. That's why he never glorified organized crime during interviews. He admitted he had made terrible choices, hurt people, and wasted years chasing a lifestyle that almost cost him everything. Acting, he said, gave him the second chance he never expected to receive. Tony often spoke about the prison theatre program that first introduced him to acting, calling it the turning point that saved his life. Without it, he believed he would have followed the same path as so many of the men he once knew, either murdered in the streets or sentenced to spend the rest of his life behind bars. Instead, he discovered a profession where his past became an advantage rather than a curse. Hollywood wasn't interested in a polished leading man. It wanted someone who looked, sounded, and behaved like the real thing, and no one fit that description better than Tony Sirico. Ironically, the same experiences that had nearly destroyed his future became the reason he finally found success. After The Sopranos ended in 2007, Tony continued acting, appearing in films, television shows, and even lending his voice to animated projects like Family Guy. But no matter what role followed, audiences always remembered him as Paulie Walnuts. The character had become inseparable from the man who created him. Even years later, people from Brooklyn's old neighborhoods reportedly approached Tony with respect, not because he had become a celebrity, but because they believed he had represented their world honestly. He never exaggerated it for attention, and he never betrayed the code that had once governed his life. Tony Sirico passed away on July 8, 2022, at the age of 79. Tributes poured in from co-stars, directors, fans, and countless people who had admired both his performance and his remarkable journey. Looking back, his story is almost impossible to believe. A young street criminal with dozens of arrests, bullet wounds, and years inside one of America's toughest prisons, somehow transformed into one of television's most unforgettable actors. Most people spend their careers trying to convince audiences they're believable. Tony Sirico never had that problem, because he had already lived the life everyone else was pretending to understand. That's what made Paulie Walnuts so unforgettable. He wasn't built from research, method acting, or imagination. He was built from real memories, real scars, and real experiences. Tony Sirico didn't just play a wise guy, he brought an entire world to life because he had survived it himself. His journey proves that redemption doesn't erase the past, but it can transform it into something meaningful. The streets gave Tony Sirico his reputation. Prison gave him perspective, and acting gave him a future. In the end, the man who once risked losing everything became immortal not because of the crimes he committed, but because he turned those experiences into one of television's greatest performances. That's why, decades after The Sopranos first aired, Paulie Walnuts remains unforgettable, and why Tony Sirico's story is every bit as fascinating as the character who made him famous. If you want more deep dives into the hidden world of the American Mafia, subscribe now and don't miss the next story.